Officer, I'm just doing my job. I deliver in this neighborhood every week. Here's my ID and company scanner.
I'm going to need you to put your hands behind your back while I verify this. You fit the description of someone going door to door.
Please, these are
hands
delivery
back,
people
now.
order. Hey, come on.
Wynton Wells stood frozen in the afternoon heat of Miami's exclusive Coral Gables neighborhood, a package still clutched in his hands as the police cruiser had suddenly pulled up alongside him. Officer Jason Avery emerged with his hand hovering near his holster, his face set in a rigid mask of authority that Wynton had learned to recognize all too well in his 34 years. The uniformed officer approached with measured steps, his eyes scanning the stack of packages in Wynton's delivery cart and the company logo emblazoned across his moisture-wicking polo shirt. Wynton's heart hammered in his chest, even as he maintained the calm, professional demeanor that had served him well during his 3 years with the delivery company, knowing that any sudden movement or sign of frustration could escalate the situation. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and be sure to subscribe so we can continue to cover more cases just like this. I need to see some identification, and I need to know exactly what you're doing in this neighborhood, Officer Avery demanded, positioning himself between Wynton and the house where he had been about to deliver a package. Wynton nodded slowly, carefully reaching toward the ID badge hanging around his neck, making sure his movements were deliberate and visible. I'm a delivery driver for Fast Track Courier Services. I deliver packages in this neighborhood every Monday and Thursday, he explained, his voice steady despite the familiar knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. Officer Avery took the badge, examining it with exaggerated scrutiny while keeping one hand near his weapon, his eyes occasionally flicking up to compare Wynton's face with the photo ID. Mrs. Davis at 1422 called about a suspicious man going door to door, Officer Avery stated, handing back the ID with visible reluctance, his posture remaining tense and confrontational. Wynton gestured carefully toward his delivery cart filled with clearly labeled packages and the electronic scanner in his hand displaying his delivery route. I understand your concern, officer, but I'm just doing my job. I've got 16 more deliveries to complete in this neighborhood today, Wynton responded, maintaining eye contact while trying to project both confidence and deference, a balancing act he'd perfected through years of similar encounters. Officer Avery's radio crackled with static as he stepped slightly back, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the packages in Wynton's cart, seemingly searching for any inconsistency or reason to prolong the detention. How do I know these packages actually belong to residents here? Officer Avery questioned, his tone suggesting Wynton might have fabricated the entire delivery scenario as a cover. Wynton pointed to the electronic scanner in his hand, which displayed the delivery manifest with addresses and recipient names clearly visible on the screen. Every package is logged in our system with the resident's information. You can verify any address right here, Wynton explained patiently, offering the device while silently counting the minutes this interaction was costing him on his tightly scheduled route. Officer Avery ignored the offered scanner, instead circling around to examine Wynton's delivery vehicle parked at the curb, his suspicion evident in every movement as he peered through the windows at the additional packages inside. You say you've been delivering here for how long? Officer Avery asked, returning to stand directly in front of Wynton, his stance wide and authoritative in the middle of the peaceful suburban street. Wynton maintained his professional composure, though frustration simmered beneath the surface as he watched precious minutes tick by on his tight delivery schedule. I've been on this route for over a year, sir. Many of the residents know me by name, Wynton replied, gesturing toward the houses lining the street where he'd developed friendly relationships with numerous homeowners who appreciated his reliability. Officer Avery made a show of looking up and down the empty street, his expression clearly communicating disbelief at Wynton's claim of being a familiar presence in this affluent neighborhood where the majority of residents didn't share Wynton's skin color. I'm going to need you to wait here while I verify some information, Officer Avery stated, stepping back toward his patrol car while maintaining a vigilant eye on Wynton. Wynton remained perfectly still, recognizing the precariousness of his situation, despite having done absolutely nothing wrong beyond existing in a space where someone had deemed him suspicious. The Miami sun beat down mercilessly as he stood beside his delivery cart, watching Officer Avery speak into his radio, occasionally glancing up to ensure Wynton hadn't moved from the spot where he'd been instructed to remain. Families had welcomed Winton into their homes during rainstorms. Elderly residents had offered him water on hot days like this one, and children had learned to recognize the sound of his delivery vehicle. Yet one phone call had transformed him from trusted service provider to suspicious presence in an instant. "Sir, I'm going to need you to put these packages down and place your hands behind your back," Officer Avery announced as he returned from his vehicle, his right hand now unsnapping his handcuffs from his belt. Shock coursed through Winton's body as the officer's intention became clear. This routine questioning was escalating to detention despite the clear evidence of his legitimate presence. "Officer, with all due respect, I've shown you my ID and explained my presence here." "I'm just trying to complete my deliveries," Winton protested, his voice remaining measured despite the injustice unfolding before him. Officer Avery's expression hardened as he moved closer, the handcuffs now fully extended in his grip, as he repeated his command with increased authority. "I said, hands behind your back, now." "Turn around and put your hands behind your back, sir. This is not a request," Officer Avery demanded, his voice carrying across the quiet suburban street as neighbors began to notice the confrontation from their windows. Winton felt a cold wave of dread wash over him as he carefully set down the package he had been holding and slowly turned around, presenting his wrists behind his back while fighting to maintain his composure. The cold metal of the handcuffs closed around Winton's wrists with a series of decisive clicks, each one punctuating the humiliation of being detained in full view of the neighborhood where he had diligently delivered packages for over a year. Officer Avery gripped Winton's upper arm tightly, guiding him toward the patrol car parked at the curb while Winton's abandoned delivery cart stood as a stark testament to the interrupted workday. "Excuse me, officer, what's going on with Winton?" called out a voice from across the street where Maria Rodriguez had emerged from her home with confusion evident on her face. Officer Avery turned toward the woman without releasing his firm grip on Winton's arm, his posture straightening as he addressed the resident. "Ma'am, this is police business. Please return to your home while we conduct our investigation," he stated authoritatively, clearly displeased by the interruption. Maria stepped off her porch and crossed the street, her cell phone already raised and recording the scene as she approached with determined steps. "I know this man. He delivers our packages every week and has for months," Maria stated firmly, stopping a respectful distance from the officer while keeping her phone steady and focused on the interaction. Officer Avery's jaw tightened visibly as he noticed the recording device, but he maintained his professional tone as he responded. "We received a report of suspicious activity and we're investigating. Please step back, ma'am." Winton stood in silent gratitude for Maria's intervention, the handcuffs digging uncomfortably into his wrists as the Miami sun beat down on the developing scene, the contrast between his professional uniform and restraints creating a dissonant image. "Why is he in handcuffs? He's clearly in a delivery uniform with packages and a scanner," Maria questioned, her voice projecting enough that several other neighbors began to emerge from their homes, curious about the commotion. Officer Avery shifted uncomfortably under the growing scrutiny, his hand still firmly gripping Winton's arm as he responded, "Ma'am, I need to verify his identity and purpose in this neighborhood following a credible report from a concerned resident." Thomas Clark, the neighborhood association president, appeared from 2 doors down, his expression serious as he approached the scene with purposeful strides, adding another witness to Winton's detention. "That's completely unnecessary. He's been delivering here for ages," Thomas stated as he joined Maria, his own phone now out and recording the interaction from a different angle. Officer Avery's expression tightened as he found himself suddenly confronting not just Winton, but also articulate, confident neighbors who seemed unafraid to question his authority in this situation. "I understand your concerns, but I have procedures I need to follow when we receive reports about suspicious individuals in the neighborhood," Officer Avery explained, his tone becoming increasingly defensive as more neighbors appeared on porches and sidewalks. Winton remained silent, knowing from painful experience that protesting too vigorously would only give the officer reason to escalate the situation further, so he stood with dignity despite the handcuffs restraining him. "This is absurd. I just received a package from him yesterday," called another voice as Eleanor Davis's next-door neighbor stepped forward from the growing crowd of onlookers. Officer Avery maintained his grip on Winton's arm, though uncertainty began to flicker across his face as the united front of neighbors continued to grow more vocal in their defense of the delivery driver. "Can someone please tell Mrs. Davis that the suspicious person is just our regular delivery guy?" Thomas called out to the gathered neighbors, his voice carrying a note of exasperation that reflected the absurdity of the situation. Several phones recorded the scene from different angles as Winton stood handcuffed beside the patrol car, his professional demeanor maintained despite the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in front of customers who had come to know and respect him. "Officer, I have my delivery receipt from this morning showing Mr. Well delivered my package," announced an elderly resident who approached with a printed slip in hand, her indignation evident as she held out the paper bearing Winton's name and the delivery company's logo. Officer Avery hesitated, clearly caught between maintaining his authority and acknowledging the mounting evidence that his detainment might be unwarranted and increasingly difficult to justify to the gathering crowd. "I'll take that into consideration, ma'am, but I still need to complete my verification process," Officer Avery stated, though his tone had lost some of its earlier confidence as neighbors continued to emerge from their homes. Winton felt a complex mixture of humiliation and gratitude as he watched the community rally around him, their collective voices challenging the presumption of suspicion that had led to his detainment. "Is this really necessary, officer? The man is clearly doing his job," Thomas pressed, gesturing toward the abandoned delivery cart with its clearly labeled packages awaiting delivery. Officer Avery shifted his weight uncomfortably, the growing crowd of witnesses clearly not part of the scenario he had anticipated when responding to Mrs. Davis's call about a suspicious person. "I'm just following protocol based on the report we received," Officer Avery insisted, though his grip on Winton's arm had loosened slightly as the weight of community scrutiny bore down on him. Winton's thoughts turned to his 2 children waiting at home, how he would explain this incident to them, and whether this would become yet another lesson in navigating a world that too often viewed their father with unwarranted suspicion. "Officer, we all recognize him. He's been our delivery person for over a year now," Maria stated firmly, her phone still recording as the crowd of neighbors continued to grow along the sidewalk. Officer Avery maintained his official demeanor despite the mounting pressure, though he had stopped guiding Winton toward the patrol car as the situation evolved around him. "I appreciate your input, but I need to follow proper procedure when responding to a suspicious person call," Officer Avery insisted, his voice carrying less conviction as he found himself increasingly outnumbered by residents contradicting the very premise of his response. Winton stood silently with his hands cuffed behind his back, hyper-aware of how quickly situations like this could escalate if he displayed even a hint of the frustration building inside him. "This is what happens when people call the police on black people just doing their jobs," Thomas stated loudly enough for everyone gathered to hear, causing several neighbors to nod in agreement. Officer Avery's posture stiffened at the implicit accusation of racial profiling, his face flushing slightly as he responded, "This has nothing to do with race. We responded to a call about suspicious behavior in the neighborhood." Maria stepped closer, her phone steady in her hand as she deliberately panned from Winton's professional uniform to his company vehicle and finally to the handcuffs restraining him, creating a visual narrative of the incongruity of the situation. Thomas moved to stand beside Winton's delivery cart, pointedly lifting one of the packages to display the address label that clearly matched a house on the street. "I have his delivery confirmation right here on my phone," called out another neighbor, holding up her mobile device displaying an electronic receipt with Winton's name and photo. Officer Avery found himself increasingly cornered by evidence contradicting the suspicion that had led to Winton's detention, yet he seemed reluctant to back down or remove the handcuffs that had transformed a routine delivery into a public spectacle. "If you want to resolve this quickly, you could simply verify with his employer. I'm happy to call the delivery company myself," offered Thomas, his phone already in hand, as he awaited the officer's response. Officer Avery hesitated, clearly weighing his options as the crowd of neighbors continued to grow, their collective presence creating an impromptu community audit of his actions. "That won't be necessary. I can contact dispatch to verify his employment," Officer Avery stated, though he made no immediate move to do so as he maintained his position beside the handcuffed Winton. Maria exchanged glances with Thomas before addressing the officer again, her voice carrying a clear note of challenge. "If you're going to verify his employment, Shouldn't you do that before putting him in handcuffs and interrupting his workday? Several neighbors murmured in agreement, the collective disapproval becoming palpable as Winton continued to stand with dignified silence, allowing the community's voices to advocate on his behalf. Officer Avery's radio crackled with a transmission, providing a momentary distraction from the intensifying standoff between law enforcement and neighborhood residents. While we're waiting, perhaps you could explain exactly what suspicious activity was reported, Thomas asked, his tone measured but insistent as he continued recording the interaction. Officer Avery shifted his weight uncomfortably before responding. We received a call about an unknown individual going door to door in the neighborhood. Maria's eyebrows rose in disbelief as she gestured toward Winton's clearly marked delivery uniform and vehicle, her expression conveying the absurdity of considering professional delivery service as suspicious activity. Several neighbors had begun to speak among themselves, reconstructing the timeline of events and speculating about which resident might have made the call that led to this unnecessary confrontation. That unknown individual delivered my grocery order last Thursday, called an elderly man from his porch, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. Officer Avery's composure began to visibly crack under the mounting evidence and community pressure, though he continued to maintain his hold on Winton's arm as if relinquishing it would somehow constitute an admission of error. I understand your concerns, but I still need to complete my verification process, Officer Avery repeated, though with noticeably less conviction than his earlier assertions. Winton shifted slightly to relieve the discomfort of the handcuffs, careful to make no sudden movements that might give the officer reason to tighten his grip or escalate the situation further. Officer, I believe this has gone far enough. Either charge him with something specific or remove those handcuffs, Thomas stated firmly, stepping forward to position himself directly in Officer Avery's line of sight. The Neighborhood Association president's authoritative tone seemed to carry particular weight, causing Officer Avery to reassess the increasingly untenable situation he found himself in. I'm still in the process of investigating the reported suspicious activity, Officer Avery insisted, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence as he stood surrounded by residents contradicting the very premise of his investigation. Winton maintained his composed silence, recognizing that the neighbor's intervention was proving more effective than anything he could say in his own defense, their collective witness serving as a powerful counterbalance to the officer's authority. Mrs. Davis probably made the call. She does this all the time, whispered one neighbor to another, though loud enough for many in the gathered crowd to hear. Officer Avery pretended not to notice this commentary, though his increasing discomfort was evident in his shifting posture and the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead in the Miami heat. Perhaps someone could invite Mrs. Davis to come out and identify whether this is the suspicious person she reported, suggested Maria, her tone making clear the absurdity she found in the entire situation. Thomas nodded in agreement, turning toward the house belonging to Eleanor Davis, the elderly resident known throughout the neighborhood for her frequent complaints about delivery people, landscapers, and other service workers who regularly visited the community. If this is based on Mrs. Davis's call, we should clarify immediately that Winton is our regular delivery person, Thomas announced, his voice projecting authority as he addressed both Officer Avery and the gathered neighbors. Officer Avery's radio crackled again and he turned slightly away to respond, though his hand remained firmly on Winton's arm as he spoke in hushed tones into his shoulder-mounted device. Maria stepped closer to Winton, her phone still recording, but her expression conveying sincere concern as she asked quietly, "Are you okay, Winton?" Winton nodded slightly, maintaining his dignified composure despite the handcuffs and the public nature of his detainment, knowing that any display of frustration would only complicate an already volatile situation. "My sergeant is on his way to assess the situation," Officer Avery announced after completing his radio communication, his tone suggesting he viewed this escalation as necessary backup rather than supervision of his actions. Thomas exchanged glances with Maria before responding. "Good. We'd like to speak with your supervisor about why a delivery person in uniform is being detained in handcuffs, despite multiple residents verifying his identity and purpose here." The crowd had grown to include at least 8 neighbors, forming a loose semicircle around Winton, Officer Avery, and the patrol car, their collective presence creating an undeniable witness to the unfolding events. Several neighbors had positioned themselves strategically to capture different angles of the scene on their phones, ensuring that every aspect of the interaction was thoroughly documented from multiple perspectives. "While we wait for your sergeant, perhaps you could tell us your badge number," Maria suggested, her phone zooming in on Officer Avery's nameplate and badge as she spoke. Officer Avery straightened his posture, clearly uncomfortable with the request, but aware that refusing would only escalate tensions further with the increasingly organized group of residents. "Officer Jason Avery, badge number 4738, he stated reluctantly, his eyes scanning the crowd as if assessing potential threats among the middle-aged homeowners and retirees who had gathered on their quiet suburban street. Thomas immediately recorded this information in his phone, and making the documentation process deliberately visible to ensure Officer Avery understood that his actions would be subject to formal review. "I'm calling Fast Track Courier Services right now to verify Winton's employment and schedule," announced one of the neighbors, her phone already at her ear as she stepped slightly away from the group. Officer Avery shifted uncomfortably, the multiple levels of community intervention clearly exceeding his expectations, when he had initially responded to what he had anticipated would be a routine suspicious person call. "That won't be necessary. My sergeant will handle any additional verification," Officer Avery insisted, though his tone lacked the authority it had carried at the beginning of the confrontation. The neighbor ignored his objection, speaking clearly into her phone as she explained the situation to the delivery company's customer service representative, her voice projecting enough that everyone gathered could hear her detailed description of Winton's current detention. "I have the dispatcher on speakerphone," the neighbor announced, returning to the center of the group with her phone held out before her. A professional female voice emerged from the device. "This is Fast Track Courier Services Dispatch, confirming that Winton Well is our employee assigned to the Coral Gables route today, scheduled for deliveries in your neighborhood between 1 and 3:30 p.m. Officer Avery's jaw tightened visibly as this official verification echoed across the gathered crowd, undermining any remaining justification for Winton's continued detention. Thomas stepped forward with renewed confidence, gesturing toward Winton's handcuffs as he addressed Officer Avery directly. "You've heard from his employer, you've seen his ID, and multiple residents have verified his regular presence here. There is absolutely no reason to continue this detention." "My sergeant will make that determination when he arrives," Officer Avery stated, though his voice had lost much of its earlier conviction as the evidence mounted against his actions. A second patrol car pulled up to the scene, drawing the attention of the gathered crowd as Sergeant Samuel Phillips emerged, his experienced eyes quickly assessing the unusual tableau of a handcuffed delivery driver surrounded by protesting neighbors. "What's the situation here, Officer Avery?" Sergeant Phillips asked as he approached, his tone professional, but his expression betraying concern about the crowd of residents with recording devices focused on the scene. Officer Avery straightened his posture as he addressed his superior. "Responding to a suspicious person, call at 1422 Coral Way. Subject claimed to be a delivery driver, but I needed to verify his identity and purpose in the neighborhood. He is our delivery driver. We've been telling your officer that for the past 20 minutes. Maria interjected before Officer Avery could continue his explanation. Sergeant Phillips turned toward the residents, quickly recognizing the community backlash evident in their expressions and the multiple phones recording the interaction. "We have his employer on speakerphone right now, confirming his identity and route assignment," Thomas added, gesturing toward the neighbor still holding her phone with the dispatcher on the line. Sergeant Phillips nodded thoughtfully, taking in the delivery uniform, the cart full of packages, and the clearly labeled delivery vehicle before turning back to Officer Avery with a questioning expression that conveyed volumes without a single word being spoken. "The caller reported someone going door to door who didn't belong in the neighborhood," Officer Avery explained defensively, his posture rigid as he addressed his sergeant. Thomas stepped forward, his voice measured but firm as he responded. "And what you found was a uniformed delivery person with ID, a scanner showing his route, and a vehicle full of packages. At what point did the handcuffs become necessary?" Sergeant Phillips surveyed the scene once more, his expression growing increasingly concerned as he noted the multiple cameras recording the interaction and the unified front presented by the neighborhood residents. Winton remained silent throughout this exchange, his dignified bearing despite the handcuffs creating a powerful image that contrasted sharply with the accusations of suspicious behavior that had led to his detention. "Let's resolve this situation," Sergeant Phillips stated, turning to Officer Avery with clear instruction in his tone. Officer Avery hesitated momentarily before producing the key to the handcuffs, his reluctance evident in every movement as he finally released Winton from restraint. The tension in Winton's shoulders eased slightly as the handcuffs were removed, though he maintained his professional composure, rubbing his wrists gently as he faced the officers and the gathered neighbors who had intervened on his behalf. "On behalf of the department, I apologize for the inconvenience, Mr. Well," Sergeant Phillips offered, his tone genuine, though his eyes reflected concern about the potential ramifications of the incident. The gathered crowd remained silent, phones still recording as they awaited Winton's response to this belated acknowledgement of the injustice he had endured. "Thank you, Sergeant," Winton responded simply, his voice steady despite the emotional turmoil of being publicly detained while simply performing his job. Sergeant Phillips turned to address the gathered neighbors, his expression conveying professional concern as he surveyed the numerous recording devices still trained on the scene. "I appreciate your community involvement and vigilance in this matter," Sergeant Phillips stated, choosing his words carefully in recognition of the digital documentation that would likely extend the incident's impact far beyond this Miami street. Thomas stepped forward from the group, his phone still recording as he responded. "We appreciate your intervention, Sergeant, but this should never have happened in the first place. Our delivery driver was handcuffed for doing his job while black. I understand your concerns, and I assure you this incident will be thoroughly reviewed according to department policy," Sergeant Phillips promised, his gaze briefly shifting to Officer Avery, who stood rigidly beside his patrol car. Officer Avery avoided eye contact with both his superior and the gathered residents, his posture defensive as he awaited further instructions. "We would like to file a formal complaint about Officer Avery's conduct today," Maria stated, her voice carrying the collective sentiment of the neighbors who had witnessed Winton's unwarranted detention. Sergeant Phillips nodded in acknowledgement, producing his departmental business card and offering it to Maria with a respectful nod that conveyed his understanding of the seriousness with which the community viewed the incident. "Mr. Well, you're free to continue your deliveries. Again, I apologize for the interruption to your workday," Sergeant Phillips stated, turning back to Winton with genuine regret evident in his expression. Winton nodded in acknowledgement, moving carefully back to his abandoned delivery cart as the neighbors created a path for him, their expressions conveying support and shared indignation at his treatment. "We'll make sure your supervisor understands why your deliveries might be delayed today," Thomas assured Winton, placing a supportive hand briefly on his shoulder before turning back to address the officers. Officer Avery remained beside his patrol car, his earlier authority significantly diminished as he stood under the dual scrutiny of his sergeant and the neighborhood residents who had effectively challenged his judgment. "I've already spoken with my dispatch supervisor who wants the badge numbers of both officers and the incident number for their corporate legal department," announced the neighbor who still held her phone with the delivery company representative on the line. Sergeant Phillips provided the requested information without hesitation, his professionalism intact, even as the situation continued to develop layers of accountability that would extend far beyond this initial confrontation. "Fast Track takes the safety and dignity of our drivers very seriously," the dispatcher's voice emerged from the speakerphone, audible to everyone gathered around the scene. Officer Avery shifted uncomfortably as corporate involvement added another dimension to the incident, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance rather than engaging with any of the witnesses surrounding him. "We'd like to know what will happen with the person who made the false report," one neighbor asked, addressing Sergeant Phillips directly, as Officer Avery began to retreat toward his patrol vehicle. Sergeant Phillips considered the question carefully before responding. "We'll be following up with the reporting party to clarify department policy regarding appropriate use of emergency services." Several neighbors exchanged knowing glances, their expressions suggesting this was not the first time Eleanor Davis had unnecessarily involved authorities in routine neighborhood activities. "Perhaps Mrs. Davis needs to understand that delivery people are not suspicious merely for existing in our neighborhood," Maria suggested pointedly, her comment drawing nods of agreement from several of the gathered residents. "I should get back to my deliveries," Winton stated quietly, his professional focus returning as he surveyed the packages still waiting in his cart. The neighbors parted respectfully, though several approached to offer personal apologies for his treatment. Each interaction captured on the phones, still recording the scene. "We're sorry this happened in our neighborhood, Winton," Thomas stated, his voice carrying enough for both officers to hear the sentiment clearly. Sergeant Phillips nodded to Officer Avery, a silent instruction to return to his vehicle as the sergeant remained to ensure the situation fully de-escalated and to answer any additional questions from the concerned residents. The department will be reviewing this incident in detail, including all officer actions and the initial response, Sergeant Phillips assured the gathered neighbors, as Winton carefully maneuvered his delivery cart back toward the house where his work had been interrupted. Thomas nodded in acknowledgement, but his expression remained serious as he responded, "We'll be following up with a formal complaint and request for investigation. This isn't acceptable in our community." Maria stepped forward to stand beside Thomas, her phone still recording as she added, "And we'll be sharing our recordings with local media and community organizations to ensure this receives appropriate attention." Sergeant Phillips's expression remained professionally neutral, though the slight tightening around his eyes suggested he recognized the potential public relations impact of the incident that had unfolded in this affluent Miami neighborhood. "Winton, we've got your back, all of us," called one of the neighbors as the delivery driver returned to his routine, the simple statement drawing murmurs of agreement from the gathered residents. Officer Avery sat in his patrol car, his expression unreadable as he observed the community solidarity that had effectively challenged his authority and forced accountability for his actions. "I'll be providing all residents with information on how to submit their witness statements and recordings," Thomas announced to the group, his organizational skills as neighborhood association president coming to the fore as he ensured the incident would be thoroughly documented from multiple perspectives. Sergeant Phillips remained on scene, answering questions and providing his contact information to concerned residents while maintaining a professional demeanor despite the increasingly clear evidence that his officer's response had been disproportionate and potentially discriminatory. "Do you need anything else from us today, Winton?" Maria asked as the delivery driver prepared to resume his interrupted route. Winton paused briefly before responding, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the preceding events. "Just knowing you all stood up for me means everything. Thank you." The simple sincerity of his gratitude resonated through the gathered crowd, reinforcing their collective conviction that their intervention had been necessary and right. "We'll be checking in with Fast Track to make sure there are no repercussions for your delayed deliveries today," Thomas assured him, his phone already in hand to make the necessary calls to protect Winton's employment status following the incident. "The department will be issuing a formal response once our review is complete," Sergeant Phillips stated as he prepared to conclude his involvement in the scene. Officer Avery remained in his patrol car, his earlier confidence replaced by a subdued demeanor that suggested he recognized the professional consequences likely to follow from his actions today. "We'll be watching for that response," Thomas assured the sergeant, his tone making clear that the community would not allow the incident to fade from institutional memory or accountability processes. The gathering began to disperse as Winton resumed his deliveries, though several neighbors remained on their porches, watching protectively as he moved from house to house with his packages, their presence a silent assurance that he remained under their collective guardianship. 3 days later, the Miami Police Department issued a formal apology to Winton Well and announced that Officer Jason Avery had been placed on administrative leave pending completion of an internal investigation into the incident. Fast Track Courier Services released a statement supporting their employee and implementing new protocols for assisting drivers who experience similar situations, including immediate legal support and incident response teams. The video recordings captured by multiple neighbors had accumulated over 2 million views across social media platforms, sparking renewed conversations about racial profiling and the power of community intervention in cases of apparent police misconduct. Winton continued his delivery route in the neighborhood, now greeted with waves and words of support from residents who had witnessed or heard about the incident, their collective response transforming an act of discrimination into a powerful statement of community solidarity and accountability.